Today's lecture is our designated annual Chautauqua lecture, which serves as a symbol of the central role of this historic lecture platform in shaping American thought and action. The Chautauqua lecture is underwritten by the Sandra R. and R. Quintus Anderson Lecture Fund. Quint passed away after 20 years of celebrating the Chautauqua lecture, and we're deeply saddened to have lost Sandy just this last week. Quint and Sandy's legacy at Chautauqua lives through their 5 children and 11 grandchildren, and we extend their entire family and friends our deepest sympathies. We thank the entire Anderson family for their support, and we thank all of our families for their contributions to the Chautauqua Fund. This morning's a real treat for me, not only because we end our week with one of the most important emerging minds around this issue of question of faith, but someone I count as a dear friend. Eboo Patel is the founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps. It's a Chicago-based organization that focuses on building the interfaith movement on college campuses. In addition to this work, Dr. Patel is a regular contributor to the Washington Post, National Public Radio, and CNN, and is the author of 2 books, including Acts of Faith, The Story of an American Muslim in the Struggle for the Soul of a Generation, which won the Louisville Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Dr. Patel served as a member of President Obama's Advisory Council of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and later joined the Department of Homeland Security's Faith-Based Advisory Council. In addition to serving on several other committees, Dr. Patel was named a Young Global Leader in the World Economic Forum and an Ashoka Fellow, part of an elite network of social entrepreneurs with ideas that have the potential to change the world. He receives his bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and holds a doctorate from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. He's joined today by his wife, Shanaz, and their 2 sons, Zaid and Khalil, are in Boys and Girls Club this week, and it's been my privilege to spend time with his entire family, formally and informally. They're equally as delightful as what you're about to experience from Eboo this morning. Please join me in providing a warm Chautauqua welcome to Dr. Eboo Patel.
Thank you. Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In what other major intellectual institution in America do you get your wife and kids ferried around in the magic chariot of the president's golf cart by the president himself, who warns the parents that there are not particularly good shocks on the golf cart, and so watch the bumpiness, but heeds the desires of the 10 and 7-year-old in the golf cart to find as many bumps as possible so that it feels like a roller coaster. No place but Chautauqua. So, because, and I say this as the highest compliment, there is a Mr. Rogers neighborhood quality to Chautauqua. Look at this. You all were like, how is that anything but a compliment? I thought that I might begin with my favorite children's story. It is a story of a village that has come upon hard times, a village that is starving, in which the inhabitants are huddled in their huts and homes, isolated from one another, afraid of each other. The people down the way, they speak the language with a different accent. The people around the corner, they speak a different language altogether at home. The people across the street, they call God something other than what we call God. Into this village comes a traveler, a woman with a pack on her back. She rolls into the center of town. She builds a roaring fire. She takes out of her pack a large pot. She goes to the river. She fills the pot with water. She goes back to the fire. She places the pot on the fire. She takes out of her pack a stone and a ladle, and she begins to stir. It was the children whose curiosity was piqued first. That will not surprise you. The children who opened up the shutters and looked and thought to themselves what was going on. And finally, the way I like to imagine it, a 7 and a 10-year-old who came hurtling out of the front door into the center of town and said, "What are you doing?" And as they started to ask, other villagers started to gather. And finally, the whole village was in this town square around this woman stirring in her pot a stone with a ladle. And she smiles and she looks around and she says, "We are making stone soup." And she continues to stir. And one of the children says, "Well, I'm hungry. Is it ready?" And she lifts the ladle out of the pot and she takes a little sip and says, "Not quite. I think it needs some carrots." And one of the family says, "Well, we've got carrots." They run back home. They get the carrots out of the fridge, which they have carefully hidden from everybody else in the village. "Do not touch our carrots." The woman chops the carrots up and throws them in the soup and continues to stir. And a couple minutes later, somebody says, "Well, is it ready?" And she takes another sip and she says, "Almost there. Not quite. Need some potatoes." And somebody says, "Well, we've got potatoes," and runs home and goes into that dark corner of the cupboard where she has hidden her potatoes so that nobody else in the village could see them or take them, and brings the potatoes to the town square and chops them up and throws them in the soup. "Is it ready?" "Not quite. Needs some spices." Somebody runs off. "Is it ready?" "Not quite. Needs some celery." Turns out somebody's got celery. And about 30 minutes later, she stirs and tastes and stirs and tastes and says, "I think it's ready." And over the course of that time, other people have set up tables in the town square. Somebody has figured out that they have bread. Another person has figured out that they have butter. Somebody has decided, well, we've got some beverages. And this starving village feasts. And the traveler smiles, and she goes to the river, and she washes out her pot, washes off her stone, cleans the ladle, puts her instruments of community building back in her pack, and heads off to the next starving village. What is this story about? I want to warn you for a moment that the next part of my talk is going to be a little bit dark. But, as the video series says, it gets better. So just hang with me for a moment. Yesterday, Rabbi Sachs mentioned who might be the most influential social scientist in the Western Hemisphere, Robert Putnam. Mentioned a book he wrote in the mid-1990s called Bowling Alone about social capital, and a book that he wrote in 2010 called American Grace about American religious diversity and devotion. And in between those two works, Professor Putnam somehow found the time to put together an important paper on diversity and community. And as I was reading this paper called E Pluribus Unum, I could not help but be reminded by the first sad part of the stone soup story. The part about the starving village. The part about isolation and fear. Robert Putnam says, In all of the analysis that he has done about diverse neighborhoods and cities in America, he has come to something of a challenging conclusion, that diversity, if left unengaged, reduces community. It erodes social capital. The higher the diversity, Putnam found, and this is just straight social science, the higher the diversity, the less the reported levels of trust. The lower the voting rates, the smaller the volunteer participation. He can't help but conclude that diversity left unengaged, you see, I'm leaving myself a little happy door, right? Diversity left unengaged, at least at first, makes people hunker down, in his words, and pull in like a turtle. They keep their energy, their generosity, their trust. You're following me here, right? Their carrots and celery and potatoes to themselves. I want to talk for a few minutes about the complications of diversity. This word that is, on bumper stickers all over the upper middle class neighborhood in Chicago in which my family and I live, that is plastered on the schools and summer camps my wife and I send our kids to. Diversity is our strength. Multiculturalism is beautiful. You will forgive my little curmudgeonly streak when I mutter to myself occasionally, why do you think diversity is only the differences you like? Why do you assume we are only speaking of samosas and egg rolls when we talk of diversity? And that somehow the most open-minded of us are the ones who can include all kinds of civilizational dishes on our plate at the same time. Diversity is not rocket science. It's harder. How do you get people who have differences you might not like to live positively with one another without hoarding their trust and their generosity, without finding a dark corner in their cupboard for their potatoes or their carrots so that their neighbors won't find them? Peter Berger, one of the great sociologists and also theological thinkers of the last 50 years, who died about a month ago, actually, in a book written in the late 1970s called The Heretical Imperative, utters a phrase that changed the course of social theory. He points out that modernity pluralizes. Modernity pluralizes, and that complicates our lives in astounding ways. He says that most human beings, through most of human history, at least in the Western Hemisphere, have lived in an enveloping homogeneity. They have lived largely, either physically or at least psychologically, in bubbles of people much like them, racially, ethnically, religiously. What did this mean? This meant that there were very limited options for how people led their lives. Sunday mornings were made for church, right? That's why God created them. Well, what happens when a Jewish family moves into town? And they don't go to this place called church. They go to a thing called synagogue. And it's Friday night or Saturday morning. Little Johnny looks at his friend Avi and thinks, if you don't have to go to church on Sunday morning, why do I have to go to church on Sunday morning? all of a sudden, in Berger's language, the introduction of diversity means that a world and an identity structure that was experienced as fate, you just go to church on Sunday morning, is now a world of choice. That's massively more complicated than simply, as Rabbi Sachs wrote in an early book of his, being handed the script of your life at birth and playing out your role. You now have to decide, or you're at least given the choice. I imagine not everybody in this hall is happy that their children or grandchildren are given said choice. There's another part of the complication of diversity, that institutions that once had a taken for granted status, the church, the college, Chautauqua, where things just, in the metaphor, rolled downhill. The pastor woke up on Sunday morning and had a congregation full of people who experienced their life as fate and therefore just went to church on Sunday morning. Well, now those institutions have lost their taken for granted status. They have become voluntary communities. That pastor's job just became a lot harder. That pastor now has to work against George Stephanopoulos and Mike Ditka on Sunday morning to fill the church. This is a far more complicated world, the world of diversity. And that complication opens the door to distrust, to fear, opens the door to hoarding our energy and our resources. This, of course, doesn't even get into the challenge of what happens if somebody has a difference that you don't like. And at the end of the day, the expressions of some identities are hurtful and insulting to other identities. When a Hasidic Jewish man on a plane receives a seat assignment next to a woman, frequently he, because of his religious conviction, feels that he cannot sit down next to this woman because of what he views as the dangers of incidental contact. It is against his religion. And of course, the woman, perfectly understandably, feels insulted. That expression of that gentleman's religious identity, and there have been not a few cases of this on El Al flights from Tel Aviv to New York, is an illustration of how the expression of one identity is hurtful to another. We Muslims, on our holiest of holy days, I say that every few weeks, and my kids are like, how can we have so many holy days? I'm like, today is a really holy day, but on our holiest of holy days, the Eids, we slaughter goats and rams and cows, and we invite family and neighbors, and we have these large Eid meals. How does that feel to Hindus and Jains and Buddhists who are by religious conviction vegetarians, who believe that every animal on earth is sanctified by God, and there are dimensions of all these traditions that believe this, and that killing them is a religious, for meat, is a religious violation. There are Jains who are so serious about this conviction that they will walk with a broom, an Indian variety broom in front of them, sweeping away bugs so they don't step on bugs. That is God's creation, just as a human being is. The Muslim practice on the holy day of eating meat, that expression is a violation of somebody else's religious convictions. I think that of all the forms of diversity, amongst the most challenging is religious diversity. Why? The great theologian Paul Tillich speaks of religion as being about ultimate concerns. In 21st century parlance, major things. Why we were born, where we go after we die, what does it mean to lead a good life? So put religion together with diversity. All of a sudden you have different views on matters of ultimate concerns in close quarters. Muslims who believe that part of their ultimate concern in the form of ritual is eating meat on a holy day as a way of commemorating God replacing Ishmael on the rock with a ram. Jains believing that that is the deepest violation possible. That's religious diversity. Now put that together in a democracy. What's the definition of democracy? Democracy is a society in which you can make your personal convictions public. So all of these people, with their different and diverging and conflicting ultimate concerns, can get up on their soapbox or on the Chautauqua stage and share their view. They can start an organization that advances their ethical system. They can vote for a candidate that seeks to enact in law their ultimate concerns. They can run for office themselves. Is there any wonder that for centuries people thought that religiously diverse democracies were impossible? That as Michael Walzer, the great political philosopher, points out, that political philosophers for generations believed that in order to have a single state, you needed to have a homogeneous population. One people equals one state, the German Volk, for example. That if you wanted diversity, you had to have an empire, a dictator with a strong thumb and a big military to tamp it all down. This was the way of the world for many, many centuries. Walzer ends that section and begins the next one with this line: except in the United States of America. The American experiment is fundamentally an experiment about having a religiously diverse democracy. Communities in which people with different and diverging ideas on ultimate concerns could come together and build a nation. How does that happen? Back to the traveler in the stone soup story. It happens when you have people, leaders, who can create spaces where it is easier for diversity to cooperate. It doesn't fall from the sky. It doesn't rise from the ground. It doesn't emerge from the ocean. Diverse societies do not naturally live in happy harmony and mutually enriching cooperation. People build that. The Putnam paper pointed out that diversity, if left unengaged, tends in America towards isolation. It has tended elsewhere, and certainly in our history, towards outright conflict. How do we move diversity, engage it in a manner such that we achieve pluralism, which, following Diana Eck, I view as positive engagement between different people, respect for identity, positive relationships, a commitment to the common good. You need leaders. Leaders who have three things. Number one, a vision. Imagine for a moment this traveler. Imagine her hearing about this village, her hearing about this place where people likely have resources and food, and yet they are starving, where they lock their doors and close their shutters. I should tell you, Chautauquans, there are places in America where people do that. Where they don't share, where they're not generous. She hears this story. Maybe from her mountaintop, she peers with her binoculars over this village, this disparate group of people afraid of each other. And you know what she sees? She sees the potential for a community. She has a vision. Other people just see this random collection of people who dislike each other. She sees a community. She has the gift of Marcel Proust, who famously said, the true journey of discovery is not in seeing new landscapes, it's in developing new eyes. What does it take to develop the eyes such that you see a disparate, fractious group of people, a random gathering of folks who are at each other's throats, as a future community? That's what our founders did in the late 18th century. It's not as if the people who had gathered in the 13 colonies all loved each other immediately. Our founders built, and as Bill Moyers pointed out, talked and willed this fractious set of colonies into the beginnings of a community called America. They had that vision. They had developed those eyes. What else do those eyes help us do? Those eyes help us see strangers as potential friends. Let me tell you a story. So, I'm in this country, my family's in this country, because a university started by Holy Cross priests on the Indiana countryside, about 2 hours from the city of Chicago, saw fit to let in a wayward Muslim student from India into their MBA program in the mid-1970s. Said wayward student was my father, who over the course of his years at Notre Dame barely scraped by academically, getting his PhD, developed a fierce devotion to fighting Irish football, and would pass that devotion on to his children, as I do now to mine, by taking us on the Skyway out of Chicago on football afternoons in the fall and driving us into South Bend for a football game. And our first stop would always be at the grotto. And for those who are familiar with Notre Dame or Catholic worship, you know that it's the shrine to the Holy Mother Virgin Mary. And it's surrounded by candles, and people stop and they pray when they experience loss or a major life moment, or just want the Irish to beat USC finally at Notre Dame Stadium. And that would be our first stop every time before we went to visit Touchdown Jesus and go into the stadium. So I'm 10 or 11 years old. I have acquired a modicum of Islamic learning and a couple of helpings of attitude on the side. And I want to get to the stadium. But I don't want to tell my dad that I think that this grotto thing is boring. I know that he's not going to like that. So instead I invoke my Islamic learning. And I say, Dad, you know, we Muslims, we're a fiercely monotheistic people. We don't do idols. Isn't it potentially, I don't know, a violation of our tradition that we stop here? And I pointed to the statue of the Virgin Mary. I think my dad's going to be impressed, by the way, by how much I've listened in Ismaili religious education classes. And my dad, who was never a particularly ritualistic Muslim, I mean, truth be told, I think I saw him saying more Arabic prayers in front of the Virgin Mary than I ever saw him say anywhere else in his life, you know? Tell you something, the presence of those USC Trojans can bring things out of you. My dad teaches me a deep lesson about vision and about developing new eyes. He reminds me that there's a verse in the Quran, to my surprise, he knew this verse, that called God light upon light. Said that God was like a lamp in a niche, light upon light. And he points inside this cove that is the grotto at all of these flickering candles. And he says, light upon light. And then he looks at me and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, you're always going to have a choice, Eboo. You can see the differences or you can look for the resonances. I advise you to look for the resonances. It's an early moment in my vocation of interfaith leadership. What's your vision? Do you see in a fractious group of people a possible community? Do you see in the presence of another tradition only a difference or also a possible resonance? Our hero, this traveler, had this third eye, had this vision. She saw a community. She saw resonances. And vision isn't enough. Our traveler had two other really important things. The next is that she had a knowledge base. Now you're going to have to go with me here as I conjecture a bit on our metaphor, okay? She knew that folks in the village, when they heard a different accent, when they saw the presence of Arabic calligraphy, when they saw a Jewish symbol, what was called up for them in their availability bias was just bad stuff. They just remembered the first 2 minutes of last night's evening news when they saw that Arabic calligraphy. They remembered some things that a preacher that they had heard 30 years ago speaking about Jews and Jesus in a not so nice way might have said. They invoked a negative knowledge base about what these people were like. They stayed away. They hoarded their goods. But this woman, she comes into town with an appreciative knowledge base. She looks at the Arabic calligraphy on the wall of one of the homes and she starts to think about the contributions of Islamic civilization. She knows a little bit about the Holy Quran, that God in the Holy Quran says to his prophet Muhammad, we have sent you to be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds. Rahmatul al-Amin, a special mercy upon all the worlds. She knows something of the Muslim presence and contribution in America. She knows that no small number of the first Americans who arrived on these shores were Muslim. In the early 17th century, up to 30% of the people ripped off the west coast of Africa were praying in Arabic on the slave ships to the American seaboard on the East Coast. Phyllis Wheatley, the first known poet in the African American canon, talks about her mother's Muslim rituals at home. There are Baptist churches in the South that bury their dead facing Mecca. Why? Because black slaves, as early as the 17th century, were figuring out how their Christian and Muslim and animist traditions could be kept alive together. At a black church in Savannah, Georgia, underneath the pews, there is Arabic calligraphy. A church that was used as one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. This is part of the Muslim contribution to America. What else is part of it? My 7-year-old loves arguments about basketball, so I'm going to throw him one right now. The greatest center in the history of the game was once named Lou Alcindor, but found courage and conviction and holiness and truth in Islam and changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The greatest athlete of the American 20th century was once named Cassius Clay, developed a friendship with Malcolm X, changed his name to Muhammad Ali, carried the torch through his Parkinson's disease, shaking at the 96 Atlanta Olympics, was eulogized by everyone from Bill Clinton to Billy Crystal. Billy Crystal tells this story of Muhammad Ali inviting him to go for a run with him at the country club in Louisville, where Ali would do his morning 5 miles. Billy Crystal said, I know we're friends, but I can't go because that club doesn't let Jews in. And Ali, Billy Crystal says, was so mad. He never ran at that club again. It's the Muslim contribution to America, or some of it. And if you're a traveler rolling into a village, trying to make of a fractious, fearful group of people a community, you need to know something of what their contribution to the country has been, is, and could be. What do they bring with them that helps the feast be something that feeds everybody? The third thing that this traveler did, she did not just roll up into that town and say, hey, you fools, bring your vegetables to the center. I know you've got them. Our traveler was smart enough, clever enough, had enough craft to create a space in which it was easier for people to cooperate. You know who I'm taking that line from? One of the great figures of the American 20th century, Dorothy Day, who said, you know what the Catholic worker is? It's a space where it is easier for people to be good. How do you create a space where it is easier for people to cooperate? The way she did it was through this cool little trick. You bring out a pot, you bring out a stone, you bring out a ladle, you say, we are making stone soup, and slowly but surely people are inspired to bring what they've got to the common. Well, if I wanted to create a place where people could cooperate in discourse, I'd probably have some lectures. I'd probably have some music, probably sprinkle in some plays. I'd make sure the grounds were beautiful. I'd make sure the food was fresh. I'd make sure that there was a generational element present, but also a welcome to new folks. I'd have people like Michael Hill and Gene Robinson and Bill Moyers and Maureen Ravenno and our wonderful innkeeper Rachel around. And I would say, hey, welcome. We know you've got differences and disagreements, but we believe that this is a space where it is easier for you to cooperate. We're on a porch watching a storm roll in over our lake. What might have been an ugly and insulting conversation in Midtown Manhattan or in the Loop in Chicago somehow becomes a place in which you are moved to find common ground without giving up your convictions. Oh, hello, Chautauqua. So nice to see you. What does it mean to build a place where it is easier for people to cooperate? What does it mean to be smart about the kinds of activities that bring people together, that provoke and evoke their strong commonalities instead of their deep differences? It's not that the differences aren't important, it's just that they're not everything. People say to me all the time when I do the interfaith work that I do, Eboo, you're not talking about salvation, or you're not talking about Middle East politics. You're not talking about the elephant in the room. And what I say is, you know what? If we start with the elephant in the room, we're going to miss all the other animals in the zoo. Not everybody likes that. I thought you would like that, though. Thank you. What does it mean to have a place that nurtures that? I'm going to tell a story from my own childhood. So, you know how in school there's like an inner circle of kids in grade school, and then there's an outer circle, and then there's an orbit many, many thousands of light years away? Socially speaking, that's where I existed much of my elementary school life. So you can imagine how thrilled that I was when I was 10 years old and I got invited to Brian or Steve or some such kid's birthday. And now that I have a 10 and 7-year-old, I know exactly how this goes. It's some version of, if you don't invite XYZ to your birthday party, you are not having a birthday party. We are going to be the responsible parents in this community. So I'm that kid growing up, right? So I'm invited to this birthday party, and I am over the moon about it. And on Sunday morning of the Sunday afternoon birthday party, my mom looks at this invitation, which is, against our fridge with a magnet, and it says, this is like before the days when your kid's birthday party would mean you had to hire the circus or something, right? These were the days when you could just like hang out in some kid's backyard and play duck, duck, goose, and they would make their own foods. Anyway, that's what they were doing, and they were making their own food, and it was going to be hot dogs. And because we're Muslim and don't eat pork, and because my mom was too immigrant to get on the phone and ask Steve's mom whether the hot dogs were beef or pork, she hands me on a June afternoon, dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, a plastic bag with 2 beef hot dogs. And she says, you have to ask Steve's parents to cook these up in a separate pan for you at snack time. I mean, I'm 10 years old. I've been handed these 2 beef hot dogs. Can you imagine how inelegant it is for a 10-year-old boy to hide 2 beef hot dogs on his person in June? I looked at my mom, I swear, my first thing, I said, first you named me Eboo. I mean, seriously? But I'm a dutiful kid. I'm convinced that they invented attitude in the early 21st century because I never had attitude growing up. And I go to this party with these 2 hot dogs. Somehow I find a way to hide them on my person. And, I play duck, duck, goose or whatever we do, and then it's snack time. And I sneak into the kitchen, and I'm pretty sure nobody has seen me, and I find a dark corner in the kitchen from which I'm going to make my foray to Steve's parents to lodge my request that they find an unporked pan and cook up the hot dogs my mom sent me with. I know the Muslims in the middle row here are like bending over because they're like, we do that to our kids. There's another 10-year-old in the corner, and he's got a little plastic bag with 2. You have no idea how shocked and happy I am. So I look at him, I'm like, are you Muslim? He's like, no, man, my name is Chaim. I'm Jewish, but my mom, she... And I had no idea what a Jew was. but I'm like, you and me, we are going to be friends. Okay? And honestly, I'm 41. For the last 31 years of my life, my closest friends have been Jewish. There's a little Mr. Rogers to that story, I get it. But there's this sense from when I'm young, this instinctive sense of you and I have something in common, something really important in common. This doesn't mean that Middle East politics doesn't matter, but what mattered most in that space was a different kind of commonality. How do we create spaces with activities, with discussions, with invitations that bring out people's powerful commonalities? And what's at risk when we don't do that? You know what's at risk? People starve. If we don't have spaces where we bring our vegetables and our bread and our butter and our resources and our gifts and our generosity to the common table, we starve. We isolate and we starve. America, I think the world depends on travelers like this woman. Right? There's this great poem by William Carlos Williams. Y'all will recognize this. He says, so much depends on that red wheelbarrow lying beside the woodshed, glistening with rain, beside the white chickens. We just don't know how important these places like Chautauqua, these leaders who have the vision and the knowledge base and the skill set to nurture a space that brings what could be divergent and conflicting difference together in productive and cooperative community. How do we do more of that? Well, one thing I think we do is we give it a name. Listen, if you think the earth's resources are precious and you are committed to stewarding them, you have a name. You have an identity category. It's called environmentalist. If you believe that every human being is born with basic dignity, and that governments should at the very least not violate that dignity and should probably protect it, you have a name. Your name is human rights activist. If you are like my wife and you take cases of the poorest people in America who have suffered violence at the hands of the state and you argue for their dignity in court, you have a name. You are a civil rights attorney. Who are the people? What are they called who nurture community amongst what could otherwise be conflicting religious diversity? I think they're called interfaith leaders. I think they need the kind of vision and knowledge base and skill set that I've delineated. I think that there are a lot of interfaith leaders in this hall. Interfaith leaders here at Chautauqua, back home on your campuses, in your congregations, in your communities. I think an interesting question is, how do you help the members of your congregation become interfaith leaders? How do you help the students on your campus develop the vision, the knowledge base, and the skill set of interfaith leadership? How do you build that ecosystem? Because there are a lot of starving villages in America. A lot of people who are fearful of each other. There's a country that needs continual building. Right? We are different, diverse, conflicting. In 1787, as Bill Moyer said earlier this week, our founders gathered for 87 days and talked a nation into existence. They recognized they had differences, and yet they said, somehow, you and me, We are going to thrive together. Somehow, you and me, we are going to build a nation together, the first of its kind, a religiously diverse democracy. They had deep in their hearts the lines, "with which I leave you." Lines from the great African American poet Gwendolyn Brooks. They knew we are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Jazakallahu khair. May God give you goodness. Thank you.
Thank you, Eboo, for calling us to create spaces where it's easier to allow diversity and cooperation and inviting us to be travelers. For those that are doing their own traveling to other Chautauqua events, please do so quietly so we can continue with our traditional question and answer period. For those that wish to join in the dialogue online, you can certainly do so on Twitter with the hashtag CHQ2017, and we welcome your participation as well. While we collect questions from the community, Eboo, what you didn't talk a lot about is the work of your own organization and how it manifests these ideals. So, perfect opportunity for a 2-minute promo to these folks about the work that you do.
Michael, thank you. You sound like a guy who leads an institution. So, the work we do at Interfaith Youth Corps, by the way, anybody in the audience know about Interfaith Youth Corps, a little bit about it? Okay, I'm honored by that. Great, thank you. So the work we do at Interfaith Youth Corps is actually very similar to the vision of Chautauqua, which is we believe that college campuses can be ecosystems that model interfaith cooperation, that advance a knowledge base that helps the rest of our society cooperate better, and that can nurture a set of leaders that can be like these travelers, that are interfaith leaders who have the vision, the knowledge base, and the skill set to build interfaith cooperation. So, there are a handful of people I've run into from colleges that I've been to. Eckerd College earlier, the chaplain, my friend, is here. Board member from Chautauqua College is here. I've been to both of these places earlier this year. So, just as this place is a model environment, advances the knowledge base, and nurtures leaders for the rest of the society, we're looking at America's 2,700 or so institutions of 4-year residential higher education and attempting to do the same. We help administrations do strategic plans. We help faculty members develop courses in interfaith studies. We train students to be interfaith leaders in 3-day institutes in Chicago. So that's what we do.
Question about how your work interfaces with major issues of the day, and a question about, does your organization work on things like gun violence in Chicago? How do you think about this grand construct in the concept of major issues that might be ailing society?
Right. That's a great question. The IFYC staff and network contains people who would have different and conflicting visions and views on many of the major issues in our society. So they would be opposed to gun violence, but they would have different views on the interpretation of the Second Amendment or the presence and legality of guns. Same with any other hot button issue. I have my own views on these things. I tend to be socially progressive on most of them. The work we do at IFYC is not to build strong advocacy for particular points of view. It's to do something a bit closer to what you do at Chautauqua, which is to build the muscles of how do we live in a society with people who have such different views. In other words, how can a social progressive like me, who honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a gun. You know, I probably have, but, or in the hands of somebody that's not a law enforcement official, right? Like it's not my thing, right? How do I have a conversation with somebody who has a different view, right? How do I can come to some understanding of his or her story, some sense of, oh, okay, you're not crazy, you're just different. How do we live together, right? And we might vote differently on this in the polls, and if a disaster hits your house, I'm gonna show up with chicken soup. Just because we disagree on this doesn't mean that we can't work together on anything.
So, a question from Twitter, and this is a name that has been coming up in all of our conversations this week, and the contributor says, I'm a none, N-O-N-E, a non-believer, like 23% of the United States. Isn't intercommunity a better, more inclusive term rather than interfaith? And how do you accommodate folks that may claim no faith in the work that you've described?
So that is an excellent question. I will answer the first part. I'll answer the second part first, and then the first part second. So IFYC, on a staff of 45 people, probably a dozen people would call themselves some version of none, right? Which is to say that on the typical boxes on the Pew surveys, they have to check none, right? Now they actually have a set of proactive labels for themselves: atheist or spiritual seeker or humanist or agnostic, but they do not fall into what we typically think of as world religions categories. So for practically speaking, all kinds of quote-unquote nones are involved in IFYC at probably levels that roughly mirror the demographics of America, 25%, if not higher. And that would be the same for the network of college students and campuses that we work with. So the first part of the question is important, which is, why do we use the word faith, right? So this is where I get very geeky, right? It depends on how you define faith. And the way we define it is a relationship with a tradition. That tradition can be Islam or UCC interpretation of Christianity or Orthodox Judaism. It can be secular humanism. It can be the tradition of the great American skeptics. It can be the tradition of Bertrand Russell, right? We believe that people come to the table with some relationship with these traditions, shaped somewhat by them, and we want to do our part in nurturing the continuity of those traditions even as they adapt. So we don't want to just deal with people as individuals, but we also don't want to just deal with them only in the category of Catholic, right? So instead what we say is, the question we ask is, Joe, how have you been nurtured by the Catholic tradition to serve others and other things as well, right? So this is a definition of faith that comes out of the work of the great comparative religion scholar Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Let's say a final thing here, which is Chautauqua is unique in many, many ways, but one of the ways it's especially unique is you take religious diversity seriously, right? That's not the case in most other quarters of American life. The diversity conversation on college campuses, frankly, quite rarely deals with religious diversity, with the exception of a handful of Catholic universities who, because of their own Catholic identity, are intellectually and spiritually in conversation with other religious traditions. The other exception, I would like to think, are the campuses IFYC has worked with. We find that if you don't put the uncomfortable identity of faith into the room, it doesn't show up, right? And that means that our muscles around dealing with religious diversity atrophy, which I think is an especial sadness in the American project, because I think one could argue that the one identity our founders got mostly right in the late 18th century was religious identity and diversity. right? So they build a muscle framework, if you will, around how to have a country that welcomes people from a range of religious backgrounds, that respects their identity, that welcomes them into the broader polity, but that does not allow any one group to dominate. To lose that muscle in contemporary diversity conversations, I think, is sad and dangerous for an increasingly religiously diverse world. Therefore, we believe that we have to front the religious dimensions of diversity, of which there are many, recognizing it potentially runs the risk of making for quote-unquote nuns ask, do we belong? And then one step in, I would like to think that they realize they do. And again, there's 15 years now of history of IFYC with 25% of our staff and participants as nuns.
Well, so perhaps a less theoretical question. What have you been holding in your hand while you've been speaking, and what does it represent?
So this is a thusbee. This is, so it's Muslim prayer beads. And I am an Ismaili Muslim, which is kind of a Sufi-oriented interpretation of Islam, and part of the belief system of many Muslims, but particularly those with a Sufi orientation, is you do zikr, or the remembrance of God, right? So, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah. I have this with me basically anywhere I go, unless I'm in a swimming pool, and in a meeting or at a talk, I'll just have it out, and I'll just be kind of in the back of my mind, chanting the name of God or the name of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's probably actually my principal prayer practice is carrying this with me. I'll tell you an interesting story. So my wife and I, we because of a minor role we played in the Obama administration in its early years, we get an invitation to Pope Francis's coming to the White House. It's not like in the Roosevelt Room. It's not like Shanaz and me and the Pope and the President. It's on the South Lawn. 10,000 of our favorite friends are there. And it's, he's waving from half a mile away. But there's significant security going in, and a woman, 3 or 4 people in front of us in the security line, she's got a backpack, and the security person pulls out of the backpack this big bag that's full of these. And the security guy, she's Catholic, right? And the security guy can't figure what these are. And the woman, I think she did not speak, I think that there was a language issue. And I finally said to the security guy, those are prayer beads, right? Because Catholic rosaries and Muslim thusbees look basically alike. And I thought to myself, when, in my religious interpretation, we have a pope-like figure named the Aga Khan, the Imam, and the presence of your prayer beads in front of him is very powerful. It means that they're blessed. And I know how that works, right? I've been in his presence several times. I know that in Jamaat khanas around the world, people collect prayer beads and they travel to be in the presence of the Imam, and they've got 1,000 of their friends pray. So I imagine this woman in, her church in Worcester, Massachusetts, and these hundreds of people who can't come to DC to be in the presence of the Pope, but they want their prayer beads there. Maybe their mother is sick, and that's their mother's prayer beads. And the presence of those prayer beads in the Pope will have a healing property. Maybe they're sad, and the presence of those prayer beads in the Pope will have a joyous result. So because of my Ismaili Muslim background, watching the collection of prayer beads as somebody goes and does a pilgrimage to be in the presence of the Imam, I can say to the security guy, those are Catholic prayer beads, and don't mess with them. Treat them with care, right? That a sacrament is about to take place.
One of the things that we often say about Chautauqua and Chautauquans is that we hope that Chautauquans take forth from this place that which they learned and spread that throughout their own communities. And so one of our questioners is wrestling and is asking a tough question. How can I respond to educated Lebanese Christian friends that tell me not to be naive, that there truly is a Muslim agenda? Help.
Yeah. So there's one thing I'd say, there's 1.6 billion Muslims on the planet. We're not all smart enough to have an agenda. Trust me. I mean, I would say there is a Muslim agenda. Fazlur Rahman Khan had a Muslim agenda when he created the tubular structures that made the Sears Tower and the John Hancock building possible. It's a Muslim agenda. The Prophet Muhammad said, God is beautiful and loves beauty. Come to Chicago. Those are beautiful buildings, right? I mean, Muhammad Ali had a Muslim agenda, right? Ihsan in Islam means excellence. Who was more excellent than Muhammad Ali, right? I mean, Muhammad Yunus had a Muslim agenda. God said to the Prophet Muhammad, be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds. Muhammad Yunus, who grows up upper class in Bangladesh, gets a PhD from Vanderbilt, goes back home and cannot ignore poor people in Bangladesh starving to death from a famine. So he builds the Grameen Bank in the field of microfinance. He is a mercy upon worlds that he wasn't born into, right? This is the Muslim agenda. It's an agenda of excellence. It's an agenda of mercy. It's an agenda of beauty. Ahmad Erdogan had an agenda when he started Atlantic Records. He wanted to sign Ray Charles and bring the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin to America. It's beauty, right? So, this does not mean that there are not nefarious people in the world who call themselves Muslim, right? But when you see the first 2 minutes of the evening news report on Chicago and it says only violence, does that mean that the Sears Tower does not exist, right? Does that mean that Michael Jordan or Barack Obama or Gwendolyn Brooks or the great Chicagoans didn't exist? Of course it doesn't. You don't view the first 2 minutes of the evening news on the violence in Chicago as representative of the whole city. So I would say don't do the same when it comes to 1.6 billion people who have been on the planet for some 1,400 years and have produced everybody, from Rumi to Kareem.
Because, I'm only giving you the easy questions.
I could
Here's
tell,
another
Michael,
one.
friend.
Yeah. So you talk eloquently about the founding and the mixture of interreligious dialogue in the founding, and someone asks about the specific phrase of Jefferson's where he says there should be a pursuit of happiness. Do you see a disservice in this phrase because our 21st century interpretation is the individual pursuit of happiness versus the consequence of working for public good-making or all of us getting together for stone soup?
Yeah. That's a great question. There's a great book by Andrew Delbanco, who's a professor of American Studies at Columbia University. It's called The Real American Dream. And he says you can split the American dream into 3 parts. They correspond roughly to our history in 3 parts. The first part is God. The second part is nation, and the third part is self, right? That we live in the era of self-expressiveness. Well, here's the interesting thing, right? That is not, you're starving. You're in this village, and you've shut your doors, and you've closed the blinds, and you've hoarded your food, and you're starving. And people know that, right? People know that there are deeper matters. People know that face-to-face community matters. I mean, my friend Sid Schwartz, what a great talk he gave the other day in the Hall of Philosophy. He quotes one of his mentors, this Lutheran pastor. He says, the heaviest burden for a human being is to have nobody to carry, right? please, God, do not let me be ever centrally focused on myself, right? There is a deep, deep hunger that is unsatisfied when you are centrally focused on yourself, right? And so what does it look like to engage in the art of Chautauquan community building and persuasion so that we advance a vision, increase a knowledge base, and expand a skill set such that we can create spaces where it is easier for people to cooperate, where people think, oh, I need you, right? I eat better when you come to the table, right? There's a great line by the philosopher Aimé Césaire. There is room for all of us at the rendezvous to destiny. You know, right now I'm experiencing this very much with my wonderful kids, Zayd and Khalil, right? If other kids don't play Little League Baseball, there's no Little League Baseball team. Try playing baseball on your own. If other parents don't coach, there's no Little League Baseball. The only way you have Little League Baseball is if you do it together. The great scholar Gerald Urey says, you know, America has produced three things that will last in human civilization: the Constitution, jazz, and baseball. Right? I've thought about that a lot. None of those things can you do alone. None of those things can you do without some tension, right? None of those things can you do without some negotiation. You think that Miles Davis didn't want to take the extra solo on Kind of Blue? But he negotiated and gave a little bit of it up. Because ultimately it was about the jazz composition, not about Miles. You think that Jefferson or John Adams or James Madison didn't want to have their whole say when it came to the Constitution? They negotiated. They had to give some things up, right? You can't play baseball alone. You can't play jazz alone. You can't talk a nation into existence by yourself. These are things we do together. If we focus on ourselves, we starve.
So sadly, that will have to be the last word.
Thank you. Thank you.